Everybody to take seats. Very soon we are going to start the afternoon sessions. So may I request every delegate to take their seats. I once again request every delegate to take their seats, and I request afternoon sessions moderator, Mr. Martin Bursik, to take the seat and start the session. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. So, looks like you are seated. We have a now it comes to the environment. And we have a rather short time to concentrate on the issue which I dedicated my life to the environment. I graduated in environmental science. And ecologist, used to be chairman of a Green Party, and now I work for United Nations Development Program as an expert in climate change mitigation and renewable energies. My role is, we've been working with Tempa, Gyaltsen, and Zamla for many years, I think 5 years at least. So this is a speaker of this 15 minutes panel. I met Tempa in Paris, the most important climate change conference, which was finally successful, and the world committed itself to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by 45% till 2030 and to create a planet carbon neutral by 2050. And Tibetan representation, of course, wasn't in an official session hall, but there was a side event and a discussion on Tibet, the third pole, as what Sikyong Lobsang Sangay mentioned, the third concentration, highest concentration of ice in the world. And so we met there. Since then, we've been working together, being on the environmental conference of the role of Tibet in August. And we are preparing a very special event in 2020, which should be a dialogue of His Holiness the Dalai Lama about the future of the planet. And so to introduce Tempa, Tempa is the head of the Environment and Development Desk, which is part of the Tibet Policy Institute. Tibet Policy Institute is located here, down there. And it's a kind of think tank which is delivering information and supporting the Tibetan government in exile. So I will not spend more time. Tempa, it's your turn. You have your presentation, and I will then conclude. Thank you very much. And welcome, Tempa, Gyaltsen, Zamla.
A very good afternoon to you all. And I want to thank Honorable Chair Martin for the introduction. And Martin and we, as he said, we had a long association with each other. And most recently, we invited Martin for the second Tibet Environment Conference, which we organized in Delhi. And because of shortage of time, I will go straight into my presentation. Now, today I'm going to speak on something really different from what I usually speak on, that is importance of the Tibet Plateau. Now, why I'm not going to speak about importance of the Tibet Plateau is because most of you have been working on Tibet's environment or Tibet's political and other issues, and I'm sure you are very familiar with that issue. But today, now why I'm going to speak about a title called A New Climatic Reality on the Tibet Plateau. That's because Tibet has seen unprecedented number of natural disasters since 2016, and something that really worried us and many Tibetans, and especially someone like me who work on the environmental issues. And for me, natural disasters that we have seen on the Tibet Plateau is not an isolated issue. It is becoming a new trend, a trend that might put Tibetans at great risk in the future or in a few years to come. Now, climate change and its impact is not an isolated issue on a global stage. And October, the month of October here in Dharamsala is supposed to be the best time in the year with a very cool and pleasant weather. But someone like us who have been here for the last 8 years, this October has been one of the coldest. Seems like we have transited from monsoon to straight into a pre-winter. So this is again an indication of impact of climate change. But on the Tibet Plateau, the impact of climate change is something different. Now what is happening there is the Tibet Plateau, which was once considered to be a very rain-scarce, arid landscape, but now we are starting to experience warmer and wetter weather conditions on the plateau. Now, 2016, on the 2 months of 2016, July and September, or August, we have seen numerous floods, landslides, droughts. Now, when we saw simultaneous floods and landslides at different places within 2 months, we began to wonder, could this be an isolated case, or could this be a beginning of something new? Now, the picture that you see here is what happened in Solo, in the northeastern region of Amdo. I'm not going to read out the dates and the events because of shortage of time, but I have given my paper, an 8-page paper that to the organizers, and that I'm sure many of you must have already got it. Please read it for a more detailed understanding. Now, when that happened, we wrote an article titled, "Natural Disasters in Tibet, Is This the New Normal?" We are not too sure where the weather pattern on the Tibet Plateau heading to. So we just wrote, "Is this the new normal?" Borrowing a Chinese term here. Now, quoting from my own article, it states, "A glacier avalanche, mud floods, and drought within a month of July is a natural disaster too many, too quickly." So this clearly gives you an understanding that something is not right on the plateau. So the Tibetans are worried that the frequent occurrence of natural disasters in too many places at the same time is maybe something that we should worry about. Now, despite increasing cases of natural disasters on the plateau, and also forewarned by some Chinese scientists that Tibet is beginning to see more and more natural disasters, Chinese government has not put in proper environment awareness policies in the Tibet areas. But most of Chinese environmental policies are concentrated to solve urban pollution issues. That concerns the Chinese. But areas like Tibet, Inner Mongolia, and other regions, we face a different form of environmental issue. Now, a sudden rise in the temperature and increase in natural disaster has been strongly felt by Tibetans. But the lack of information and infrastructure to mitigate the impact and adapt to a new climatic pattern, adapt to a new pattern of global weather system has left Tibetans unprepared and unprotected. Now, best option to challenge climate change is to adapt and mitigate, because climate change is inevitable. So there's no point of us denying that it's happening. So best is to first understand the issue, then see how we can adapt, and also possibly mitigate some ways to reduce the possible damage. Now then again in 2017, we continued to observe what's happening in Tibet. And there were more floods and more landslides. In 2016, many of the natural disasters occurred mostly in Amdo region, north and northeastern region. But in 2017, many of the floods occurred in south and southeastern region of Tibet, or Kham region. And they were mostly floods. Floods due to surging rivers because of increased rainfall. That's when we again wrote another article titled Flooded Tibet Struggling to Adapt to a New Climatic Reality. Now, every time we write an article, our goal is, there are two simple goals. Number one, to make the Chinese government aware of what's happening on the Tibet Plateau and what they need to do. We know Chinese government is monitoring us and what we write and what we say. That's why we deliberately put up some way forward. Because protection of Tibet's environment and Tibetan people is important for every one of us, irrespective of who does it. So important thing is to put forward what can be done and what should be done. So we have asked, in this article, we asked the Chinese government that the increasing cases of natural disasters in Tibet is not an isolated case, but it's becoming a new trend that needs government attention. Now, why we are asking Chinese government? Because at the moment, Tibet is under Chinese occupation, and China is the ruling government there, which means they have the responsibility to do what they need to do to a population that they have governed. And across the globe, governments provide adaptation and awareness programs. But in Tibet, that is lacking. And that's why people are not aware of the scale of natural disasters and impact of climate change. Now, again, as we go into 2018, there were more and more natural disasters. Now, some of the Tibetans, elder Tibetans might agree with me that in the past, our grandparents, they used to say, natural disasters would happen only in China, not in Tibet. That was a belief that elder generation of Tibetans had, because there were few natural disasters. But now, what used to happen in China is happening in Tibet. Why? Because there is a new climatic reality emerging on the plateau, which requires our attention, and which requires study and adaptation. Now, in 2018, now as I said, 2016 in north and northeast region of Tibet, in Amdo, 2017 in the Kham, and 2018 it went all the way to the center of Tibet. Now, during the month of June, July, August, September, mostly during the rainy season, many areas in the center of Tibet, Lhasa, Rinpoche, Satcha, were flooded because of heavy rainfall. And then there were other issues too. Now, the picture you see here is one of the most scary pictures you could see. And if some of you have got time to watch a small video clip of this on YouTube, was that a summer pasture being flooded. I was born in Tibet, and I have seen Tibet, but I have never seen a summer pasture being flooded. Because Tibetan nomads put up their summer pasture in an area that is slightly uplifted, so that it wouldn't become muddy during the rainy season. But here you see the whole of a summer pasture being flooded. Now, this is a new trend that we really need to worry about. And then there was a huge, massive landslide in Bolo or Jamda region of Tibet. It's a border between the current Chinese, under Chinese occupation, border between so-called Tibet Autonomous Region and Tibet area of Sichuan. Now, what happened was a twin landslide happened one after another within a month, and blocked world's third longest river and Asia's longest river for 11 days. Now, because of the blockage, whole township of Bolo was inundated. And it put millions of Chinese in the low-lying regions at risk of being flooded. Now, China being considered considered to be the second largest economy and one of the most powerful nations on earth at the moment, and also one of the fastest developing countries. Why it took 11 days for them to deploy infrastructure to release the blockage. What this shows is that lack of preparedness, lack of understanding, and a lack of climate awareness. And that's when we wrote another article stating that devastating natural disasters continue into 2018. And we have asked the Chinese government and the Tibetan public in Tibet that we Tibetans also need to plant more trees. because climate change is inevitable. It's coming. There's no point of saying that it will not happen in Tibet, but it's happening, and it's already happening. It's not that the impact of climate change has not been happening in Tibet. It has been happening since the last 50 years. But the cumulative effect, that we call it, is only beginning to emerge since 2016. And in the next few years, it's going to get only worse. And as someone who works on environmental issues, I'm really worried that at the moment, increasing cases of natural disasters in Tibet is the most serious issue that we in exile also need to take note of. And Tibetans in Tibet also need to understand that we need to adapt. And of course, the Chinese government need to put up infrastructure and mechanism to prevent natural disasters and other issues. And now this is in the winter of 2019. Our summer past year been flooded in 2018, followed by a massive snowfall in a particular area of Tibet. Now, with the shortage of time, I will not go into detail, but this is important to briefly speak on this. Now, what are the possible factors? There could be many. But as per my short research, that there are 5 possible factors. Number 1, primary cause of increasing case of natural disasters in Tibet is climate change and global warming. Tibet has seen rising temperature and increasing precipitation, which means it's getting warmer and wetter. Now, this is very important. Historically, Tibet receives very little rainfall. And the way we live, what we eat, what we plant, how we build homes, where we build homes, everything is based on the climatic condition of the place. So there's a famous book which says that a civilization and its culture is influenced by the climatic condition of that place. So it's time we need to change, because what the climate condition that prevailed for the last 2,000 years is beginning to change. So the climate change is a primary factor. Number 2, of course, climate change is a global factor, but the situation is exacerbated or gotten worse by lack of clear policy from the Chinese government. Number 1, rapid urbanization, extensive mining, and excessive construction activities has exacerbated the situation. And of course, the poor construction materials, and the quality of the homes that we build, and the location and the topography of the towns, villages, and cities being located. And of course, finally, lack of adaptation and awareness program. Now, now this is impact of climate change. Now the urbanization. Tibet has 18 county prefecture headquarters. They have declared many of the headquarters as prefecture-level cities. They are going to declare all of 18 as a prefecture-level cities. Tibet has 150 county headquarters, and all of them would emerge into bigger towns, which means there's a rapid urbanization in Tibet, and which would require careful planning, because the urbanization rate in Tibet would reach 30% by 2020, which is slightly higher than other areas in China. Now, then, of course, as I said, the poor construction. Now, if you look at these pictures, you will get a clear understanding. The number 1 is Dege, because the area is colder. They have mud walls because it keeps you warmer, and then the wooden structures that are going to keep you warmer. And then we have flat roofs, open roofs, something that is impossible here in India or other places where we receive a great amount of rainfall. Then you go into Angari region, the homes are flat, and they have high-rising embankments to block extreme cold condition. Then if you go to southeastern region of Tibet, Rungta, where there's a greater precipitation, homes are better built to withstand. So it's not that we haven't done anything. We have successfully adapted and mitigated, but somehow we are lacking that in the recent years. Then, of course, the location. If you look at the number 1 picture over there, it's in Amdo. What will happen if there's heavy rainfall on the mountains? mud flood for sure. Then what would happen here in Dege if there is a landslide? Because homes are built on steep slopes. Finally, lack of adaptation awareness program. This is what Chinese government has not done. And the Chinese government need to put up proper adaptation and awareness programs, and also need to guide not only the general public, also their own government officials to put up necessary mechanisms to challenge these issues. And we Tibetans also need to do what we need to do. That is to understand it and adapt and mitigate. Because historically, we have very successfully adapted to ever-changing climate conditions on the plateau. Not only we adapted, but we successfully existed on the plateau as a powerful, continue to increase. Because if government doesn't provide necessary information, people will not have the resources to learn and get information. Now, my final part of my presentation is what we are going to do. Now, we are going to launch something called Climate Action, COP25 Climate Action for Tibet, and this is important. Until 30th October, we were planning to have a big environment program in Chile. Oh, yeah. So this is a post that we created. Unfortunately, it has Chile. It was supposed to happen in Chile, but now it has shifted to Spain. And in Chile, we had a very, very good local logistic support. Unfortunately, now that has become, it's not going to be, we are not going to be able to use that. But now I want to ask our friend from Spain, I'm sure there are many of you, and I heard one of you are here, that we need your support to make it successful. Because we are going to also have a panel discussion in Spain, as we planned before. And also, we have 2 points from the 5-point call to action. Number one, on global climate change. This is important. On-the-loop activity, we are going to have a climate round here in Dharamsala, which is probably going to be the first, and which will be supported by our capable NGOs who are here in Dharamsala. So I want you to carry forward this climate action for Tibet in your respective regions. We will provide the logos and the slogans. It will be available online, which you can download. So this is what we are going to do. And also, most importantly, please come forward, whoever can support us in Spain, to have a successful climate action for Tibet campaign there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tempa. I think it's extremely important to have someone who is able to go deep into details of what's happening in Tibet and to deliver this information to us, because it's never enough of education of us in the environmental field, which is becoming the one of the most important issues. And if I can finish this session just by one idea I want to which I want to share with you. Tempa was discussing about and shown us the extreme weather situations and the effects up into Tibet and Tibetan regions, and so this is about adaptation. And I think that when someone asks you about the role of the Tibetan Plateau in the environment, so we all think, okay, Tibetan Plateau, it's a paradise, it's natural paradise, there's almost no pollution. So what's the importance of Tibetan Plateau in the global combating climate change? Maybe the Tibetan Plateau faces the effects of climate change, which we've seen right now in the presentation. And I think very few people know about the problem of methane being fixed in a permafrost, in a frozen ground. Average altitude of Tibetan Plateau is 4,500 meters. The concentration of methane in permafrost is the second highest after Siberia. You've experienced the Siberia forests are burning, and in Tibet it's gradually melting. There is one very negative effect of how Chinese are governing the environment there, and the local people and nomads, is that they are forcing the nomads to be resettled to the socialist villages. And you've seen here 7,000 tradition of domesticating the yaks, but they cannot do this natural activity. And that means that these grasslands are being transformed into deserts, and the melting of permafrost is speeding up. And I tell you last figure, the International Panel of Climate Change, the experts, they calculated our planetary carbon budget. It means that we in a planet, we have 720 gigatons of carbon to leak and then finish. If we want to stabilize the temperature on 1.5 degrees above the average temperature before the Industrial Revolution, we can release 720 gigatons of carbon only, and then we are over, and then the disaster will be really much more dramatic. But what is not included in the report of October of IPCC report is the effect of Tibet and Siberia. If the methane melts, it's 26 times more aggressive, and it will shorten the world's carbon budget by 5 years. So when someone asks you about the importance of Tibetan Plateau in a global climate change, you can answer that if this issue is not being solved, if it is not being if the scientists are not allowed to go there, if there are not changes of the politics within Tibet, that we all in the planet are having 5 years less to reduce greenhouse gas emission, to phase out of fossil, burning the fossils and turn to renewables. So thank you very much, Tempa, for your presentation. Thank you for your interest, and let's go to another part of the program. Thank you very much.
I think you introduce yourself.
Just in the center. No, I just didn't see that center. Well, we were just moved to center stage, which is a nice change because these early afternoon sessions are always very difficult. After a nice lunch, people are busy digesting, and so sometimes there's a risk that they doze off. But we have a very interesting topic coming up. My name, by the way, I'm the moderator, is Günther Colonia. I'm a co-chair of the International Tibet Network, but I've also a long-time board member of Associazione Italia Tibet, and in that capacity I've participated to all these international Tibet support groups since the one in Bonn in '96, so I've had some opportunity to see many of you over the years and grow and develop in this movement together. So the next speaker is also a person I've seen in I think almost all these conferences and other conferences that were not International Tibet Support Group meetings, but dealing with the status of Tibet. Michael van Walt van Praag, he's a legal expert. He was already involved as a member of the International Commission of Jurists, discussing the status of Tibet several decades ago. He's now the executive president of CREDA, and a senior fellow of the Golden Gate University School of Law in San Francisco. As I said, he's foremost expert on the status of Tibet, on the legal side of it, and he prepared a document for us, Speaking Truth to Power regarding China's claim to Tibet. You know, the narrative that China is using is that Tibet has always been a part of China. And most people in the People's Republic of China think that is the truth. And more people in the West, not knowing history, buy this Chinese narrative. So it's very important to know what's really the history. And Michael provided in his studies a documentation, the documents that in fact Tibet has never been a part of China. But I will let him tell him that in person and give some remarks at the end. Please, Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Gunther. And indeed, we've known each other very long and have worked on many subjects together over the years. It's wonderful to see so many of you here. And I just wanted to note, and I mentioned this to one or two of you already, that there was a marked difference today with the presentations as compared to the 550 conference that took place, I think it was last year, where people from all over the world were also invited and many speakers talking about the state of the world and prospects for Tibet. And I was very depressed at that conference because many people, especially the Chinese guests, were all saying how bad things were, that China was so powerful, there's really nothing we can do. Nobody was giving any scope for hope. And today it was entirely different. Today, all the speakers we've heard this morning were all talking about change. We're all talking about the signs that things are changing and that, you know, we're in the 90s. And that we can be part of this change, and that there really is hope for Tibet, for Hong Kong, for East Turkestan, for the Southern Mongolians, and others, and other movements around. Just wanted to note that. And we heard a lot about the importance of negotiations and nonviolence as a means of achieving change and resolving conflict. So today I'd like to call your attention to a development that I think, and you've heard just from Gunther about the topic that I want to talk about, a development that I think is profoundly detrimental to resolving the Sino-Tibetan conflict through meaningful negotiations. Namely, that governments today are by and large acting as if the situation in Tibet is a Chinese internal affair, one outside of their purview. Beijing has successfully implemented a well-tested Soviet strategy, which was originally developed by the army, of reflexive control, maskirovka in Russian. This strategy entails a government-sustained campaign of feeding opponents information that makes them act in ways that the government wants them to. The methods vary, and many are premised on the psychological phenomenon that when the brain is exposed to the same information continuously, it begins to perceive that information as true, regardless of conflicting or contrary evidence. An expert explains that thus, the idea is to feed your adversary a set of assumptions that will produce a predictable response. That response furthers a goal that advances your interest, the interest of the government. By luring your opponent into agreeing with your initial assumptions, you can control the narrative and the ultimate outcome in your favor. Best of all, the outcome is one in which your adversary has voluntarily acceded. Now, how is that working in respect to Tibet? Over the past decades, the PRC has, as we know, consistently fed the international community the notion that Tibet has always been a part of China or since ancient times. The result is that today many assume, without any conclusive evidence, that there is some truth to this claim. This is the effect of step one of this strategy. By having been consistently exposed to the notion that Tibet was historically a part of China, government officials, diplomats, legislators, policymakers have started to perceive this information as true, or at least partially true. This in turn has automatically triggered in them the universal norm of non-interference in the internal affairs of states. That is step two of the strategy, the predictable response voluntarily acceded to by your adversary. By getting the international community to accept the notion that Tibet may have been a part of China, however tentatively, Beijing is successfully changing the narrative with the international community's perception of, and with it, the international community's perception of the very nature of the conflict with Tibet. The Sino-Tibetan conflict is now increasingly viewed as an internal Chinese matter, and this radically limits what action governments believe they can take. They believe now they can express concerns about human rights, but they feel precluded from addressing the root cause of the conflict, which is China's unlawful occupation and annexation of Tibet. And we, to some extent, go along with it, limiting our asks largely to human rights issues and cultural preservation, and often couch even the demand for autonomy in those terms. For many years, namely from the start of the most recent Sino-Tibetan dialogues almost 20 years ago, we have mostly followed Dharamsala's lead in not emphasizing the illegitimacy of China's rule in Tibet. And this was done for the best reasons in the hope that it would encourage Beijing to respond positively to Tibetan proposals and engage in earnest dialogue on the autonomy, not upsetting or challenging the PRC leadership on the issue that Tibet challenging the PRC leadership was part of the Tibetan leaders' commitment to leave no stone unturned in efforts to make talks successful. But silence and accommodation did not have the desired effect. In fact, it enabled Beijing to take advantage and gain international acceptance for its narrative at the expense of the truth. Our governments may seem no harm in giving in to Beijing's pressure to make repeated public statements recognizing that Tibet is part of China, given that His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the CTA are today not seeking independence, but autonomy within the framework of the PRC. Yet those government statements not only reinforce the Chinese narrative, but allow Beijing to use our government's recognition as a source of legitimacy to rule Tibet. Our government statements legitimize what the PRC itself cannot legitimize: its illegal invasion, occupation, and annexation of Tibet. And what's more, in doing so, it is enabling the PRC to entirely bypass the Tibetan people and their legitimate leaders and representatives, His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the CTA. The Tibetans' leverage is removed, and the PRC's perceived need to negotiate is gone. The PRC does not claim, as you know, the right to rule Tibet on the basis of the conquest of Tibet in 1949-50 or at any other time. It does not claim it on the basis of effective control of Tibet today. It claims the right to rule Tibet on one reason alone: its allegation that Tibet was always a part of China, and is now bolstering this by pointing to our government's recognition of that claim. And this realization brings Tibet history to the foreground. Not that Beijing's claim can no longer be left unaddressed. I'm not suggesting that we bring history into the conflict or the negotiations. Beijing already did that by demanding that the Dalai Lama publicly acknowledge that Tibet has been a part of China since ancient times as a precondition to substantive talks. What I am saying is that we must challenge China's claim that it is the legitimate sovereign of Tibet today based on a false historical claim which it has been imposing on us. Because acquiescing to or not challenging China's narrative has really serious consequences for the prospects of resolving the Sino-Tibetan conflict and for the Tibetans' very survival as a people. Not challenging China's historical claim to Tibet also emboldens Beijing in advancing similar historical claims through similar historical narratives in other foreign territories in northern India, South China Sea, potentially in Mongolia and elsewhere, and it makes them much harder to refute those claims if the claim to Tibet has been accepted. Today, I can state with confidence that Tibet was historically never a part of China. I'm not saying that Tibet was historically always independent in the modern sense of that term. I'm saying that the study of Mongol, Chinese, Tibetan, and Manchu historical sources leads to the conclusion that at no time before the PRC's invasion was Tibet ever a part of China. You've been given a booklet in the package, which is a working paper, it is not completed, called Speaking Truth to Power Regarding China's Claim to Tibet, which we at CREDA, which is a conflict resolution organization, have prepared. It contains a summary of the Chinese claim that Tibet has been a part of China since ancient times, and then it unpacks that claim and its accompanying narrative, uncovering why it does not hold water. That is a precursor to a comprehensive Tibet brief, which will also contain the international legal and policy consequences of these historical findings. And that will be released next year. The booklet you have contains only those sections that we thought were most relevant to the discussion at this conference. I invite you to read it because it deconstructs and debunks the Chinese government's narrative. People, including government officials, but many others as well, give China the benefit of the doubt when it comes to history, not only because Beijing holds the largest microphone, the biggest stick, and the biggest bag of money, but also because we think we don't really know enough about the complicated history in that part of the world. The document is a long read, but I hope it answers questions that you may have on the subject and can give you some confidence to discuss and engage on the issue with anybody and everybody. And I also invite you to send some comments so that we can address them in the final version of the Tibet brief. I realize it's a lot to ask. It's much easier to propose that we leave history for what it is and concentrate on the future. And I've heard that say in many places, including in Dharamsala. But in my professional opinion, this is a fantasy option. Beijing has very little motivation to talk about the future if its historical claim to Tibet is not actively challenged. There are compelling reasons why it matters that Tibet was not a part of China and why Beijing's claim should not be left unchallenged. Let me explain only the principal ones and what they mean for our various governments' policies. It matters because it qualifies, obviously, the 1949-1950 Chinese military advance in Tibet as an act of aggression. The annexation as illegal, and Tibet's status today as that of an occupied territory. It means that Tibet's territory is disputed, that the Sino-Tibetan conflict is an international conflict, and as you know, aggression is a serious violation of international law that cannot lead to a lawful acquisition of territory and therefore sovereignty by the aggressor. This is not a matter of dispute. This is simply the way it is. It matters because it affects the legal obligations of the PRC under international law, namely the form of rule implemented in Tibet, the population transfer of Chinese into Tibet, the PRC's cultural and linguistic policies, as well as its responses to Tibetan resistance to the regime, are all subject to legitimate international scrutiny beyond the domain of human rights, because Tibet is not lawfully part of China, but an occupied territory. It also affects the legal obligations of all other states towards the Tibetans, towards the PRC, towards the Tibetan government in exile. All states, namely, have the legal obligation to regard the conflict as an international one, as an unresolved one, and to uphold international law and promote the conflict's resolution. International law, in fact, imposes an obligation on states not to recognize China's annexation as lawful and to refrain from any action that helps the PRC perpetuate its violative behavior or consolidate its position in Tibet. So speaking the truth about Tibet's historical status matters because it affects Beijing's perceived need to negotiate. The fact that Tibet was not historically part of China goes to the very heart of the legitimacy, or rather lack of legitimacy, of China's rule of Tibet. And that is the Achilles heel of the regime. But as long as Beijing senses that the international community buys into its historical narrative, it does not feel pressured either to negotiate with the Tibetan leadership, nor to change its policies in Tibet on the ground to satisfy Tibetan needs. Also, negotiations that start from the premise that Tibet was historically a part of China dramatically shifts the posts of the spectrum of possible outcomes of those negotiations, where the middle of that spectrum will no longer satisfy Tibetan needs. In order to resolve the conflict, as you know, His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the CTA have proposed genuine autonomy as an acceptable political status. That to accommodate Beijing's demand that they abandon independence as an objective. Genuine autonomy is a compromise in the middle between restoration of independence on the one hand of the spectrum and integration and assimilation into China on the other. This is what the middle way approach concretely means. But less than genuine autonomy will not satisfy the needs of the Tibetan people and will not end the conflict between the PRC and Tibet. And lastly, that Tibet was not historically a part of China matters to us all because it affects the obligations of all states and therefore of our own governments. The status of Tibet, the unlawfulness of the PRC's annexation, and the right of Tibetans to self-determination, which is discussed in detail in the booklet that you've been given, have direct consequences for the legal obligations of all states and, in fact, other international actors towards the Tibetans, the CTA, and the PRC. So it greatly matters that Tibet was not historically a part of China, but it matters also that we speak up about it. And if we have not done so sufficiently in the past 2 decades, we must now course correct to actively challenge Beijing's false historical claim. The launch of the CTA's new book, Tibet Was Never a Part of China, but the Middle Way Approach is Still a Viable Solution, is an important signal that the CTA is resetting the narrative to reclaim the truth, which will help to restore Tibet's negotiating leverage. Just to be clear, actively challenging Beijing's historical claim does not in any way reduce the importance of continued fervent advocacy on issues of human rights, including the cultural and religious rights, and on the environment. But it's about framing the issue and the discourse within which these are pursued. What led the PRC to negotiate in the past was a combination of international pressure, pressure inside Tibet, and clear language on the illegitimacy of the PRC rule in Tibet. This is what was reflected in the 5-point peace plan and the Strasbourg proposal, and also in parliamentary resolutions that were passed after those initiatives. Taken together, those were strong on the rights of Tibetans and very generous on the compromise that they proposed. International attention and pressure did bring about Sino-Tibetan dialogue 18 years ago, but it did not convince China's leaders that they had to consider real autonomy as an option, because supportive governments, quite frankly, were only pressing human rights and cultural survival issues while implicitly, effectively reassuring Beijing that it does not really have to address the core of the conflict. And this brings us to what we should do. First, we must course correct to actively challenge Beijing's false historical claim and be vocal about the lack of legitimacy of China's rule in Tibet. We must frame the Sino-Tibetan conflict as an unresolved international conflict of legitimate international cultural. This approach in every campaign statement, every legislative initiative. It requires also consistently referring to Tibet as occupied, its territory as disputed, the conflict as unresolved and international, and not as the Tibet issue, which is a euphemism that hides the truth and the urgency of resolving the conflict. It requires referring to the Tibetans and the Tibetan people not as a minority, which we hear all the time, and refraining from stating or implying that Tibet is part of China or has been in the past. Language is important because of its legal and political implications, and it has become urgent to use this language if we care about restoring to Tibetans what is on the verge of being lost, their national identity, from which the religious identity is inseparable, and also restoring a fighting chance to negotiate a meaningful autonomy to save it. We must actively lobby our governments to cease making statements recognizing Tibet as part of China. As I said earlier, it may seem harmless to them, but it is not. Such statements validate Beijing's false historical claim, even if they're not intended to. They undermine the efforts to persuade Beijing to negotiate with Tibetans, and they pull the rug out from under the Tibetan Compromise middle way approach, leaving them no leverage. Finally, we must insist that Beijing's demand that the Dalai Lama publicly acknowledge that Tibet has been a part of China since antiquity as a